Can we afford city inspection process? When a city employee has unquestionable authority, their decisions will drive up costs. So I'm Ross Ford, lifelong builder that has turned homeowner advocate for private property rights. So do we need private building inspectors? And why would we need private building inspectors? Because monopolies don't work. So let's go back in time, kind of where monopolies came from, and look at our really biggest monopolies, or kind of the ones we think of when we talk about monopolies. And we think of like Standard Oil, AT&T, the American Tobacco Company. And at some point in time, based on the needs of society, we went in and undid those monopolies. We took them away because they were a disadvantage to the public as a whole, because they were able to control the market in a negative fashion. So not long after that, they went in and did the Sherman Antitrust Act, which said not only can you not have a monopoly, but you can't have a group of businesses come together and function as a monopoly. So you can't get a group of businesses that have the ability to set prices or manipulate the market in such a way that it can control what comes to the public. And so it actually stops them from colluding and setting things the way they are. So utilities kind of are a monopoly, and we still have those, and we still let them go because it's really hard to have two power companies in one city. But what we have put in place is a public service commission that tightly regulates those. Everything they do, to include their ability to profit, has to go through a tariff process, has to go through this commission, and it's watched, because the monopoly, and as far as a process for the public, always has a negative outcome. So centralized government is kind of the government's version of a monopoly, where all that power is centralized in one spot. And we find that centralized government, it slows the processes, it increases errors, and increases miscalculations. It stops the diversity and the ability for us to govern ourselves. So a monopoly and centralization of the government are really similar, because they leave the consumer at the mercy of that one individual or one small group in a substandard relationship. A lot of people believe that government should be a monopoly, especially when it comes to regulation, that's what we need, because we need one disinterested party that has the authority and the ability to regulate the people among us. So in order for that theory to work, you have to believe that people are inherently bad, or that given the right opportunity, they will behave badly. So you have to have that single power to control those people and keep the consumers safe. The theory is kind of a theory that defeats itself when we go back to the government, because if we believe an individual would behave poorly, then just because that individual works for the government doesn't change that human instinct. So the idea that we have government that exists outside the world of any kind of incentives or interests or imperfect knowledge or anything that would affect the outcome is just a flawed belief, that obviously they're susceptible to the same things anyone else is. So let's talk about, on the building inspection side, a couple of examples of how that could impact what we do. So good example, we had a home that was being built, and I don't want to get too technical and way into the weeds, but part of what we're talking about is the energy code. So the energy code is a building code that helps us come up with what is the most efficient way for the structure to operate and conserve as much energy as possible. So the energy code says we have what we call conditioned space and unconditioned space. So if a space is unconditioned, think of an attic. So you have your insulation at some level, you have the roof above it, and that space between the insulation and the roof is unconditioned. It can get hot or cold as the elements changed. So in this particular house, we have a spot in the basement where they put in the furnace, all of the utilities, the furnace, the water heater, water softener, all of that's put in one spot. But in order to give the water heater combustion air. So it has good fresh air that's coming in so that it's not sucking air from inside the house. It's actually sucking air from outside the house, which it burns so that we have good fresh oxygen inside the house and we're not burning it up through the process of heating the water. So in order to do that, you have a pipe that brings that fresh air in. Then you build a room around it, and that room by definition, because we have that pipe coming in, becomes an unconditioned room. So because it's an unconditioned space, that energy code we talked about requires that the ductwork in that room be insulated. So there is another section in the energy code, and agreed, we have conflicting sections, and this needs to be worked out at some point. But right now, there was another section that said, however, if you have an unconditioned space, similar to that furnace room, and you don't insulate that ductwork, then it becomes a conditioned space because the heat radiated through that ductwork is adequate to heat it enough that we would consider it conditioned space. So this particular building official read one section of the code and said, no, we're going to call this unconditioned space and you have to insulate all the ductwork. So the contractor, the HVAC contractor, everybody else involved said, yes, but we have a huge problem if we do that. Because if you do that and we then have the room sealed and insulated and you have this cold air coming into the room, you have a whole bunch of tiny little 1/4-inch lines that are feeding the water softener and a variety of other things. And as soon as winter hits, it'll freeze those lines. They'll break and we flood the room. To say this is, by the definition of the code, a conditioned space because we take the insulation off the ductwork, it will heat it adequately and will no longer freeze the room. Well, the building official gets to make the final call, and he said, no, we're going to call it unconditioned space. He made them insulate it. As expected, it froze, it flooded, it was a problem. I don't know how this particular one ended up. I know they tried to put in electric heaters that would be on a thermostat and say, okay, now it's conditioned space. The building official wouldn't allow it. He just wanted the most difficult thing, and he was the ultimate authority in this centralized government kind of control that nobody could do anything about it. So let's talk about another one. This one's a block wall. I had a mason that wanted to build a block wall, and it was just a short wall. It was only 4 blocks high, so cinder block. So he got started on this wall. It's a few hundred feet long in between 2 houses, and he put in the footing. So he put some rebar in it, put the footing, and then just one of the methods when you build block wall, which I like, it works really good, you wet set. So you set that first row of block into the wet footing. So rather than putting mortar down, you set it right on the footing. The block bonds to the footing and it creates a really strong connection right there. He did that. Then while he's waiting for the footings to dry, he said, okay, well, I'm going to go work on another project for a day or two, let this set up really good and then come back. And just in scheduling. In the process of working on the other project, he ended up in the building department's office to get a permit. As they're discussing that permit, he happened to mention this other wall he was working on. And the building official came out all excited going, no, you can't be doing that. I don't know anything about that wall. How can you possibly be working on it? He says, well, it's just a short wall. We've built these walls forever. We've done it for decades in this area. We do it in the communities around. We never pull a permit for this. It's not required. It's not needed to pull a permit because it's short. So the building official said, well, yes, but what you don't understand is the city has changed their policy. Now we do require a permit. You should have got a permit. So the contractor said, well, wow, I didn't know. I'm super sorry. Everything's still exposed. You can see the footing. You can see it. What do I need to do to get the permit right now? Happy to do it. What is it going to cost me? What do you need? And he says, no, you can't. At this point, it's done. You poured the footing. We were unable to see the rebar. And so we can't inspect it. We don't know that it's right. And he said, right, but we can still see the end of the footing and we can see where the rebar is. And so you can see the rebar that runs through the footing. You can see both ends. It's fair to make the assumption that I ran the rebar all the way through. And the building official said, no, that's not fair. We won't accept it. And the building official made him go pull it all out. So he had to pull it all out, throw it away, reset up, pour a new footing, this time let the building official or send an inspector to come look. So he got to the point where he was needing an inspection. Inspector showed up, kind of figured out what the wall looked like he was building, and said, why am I even here looking at this? This is a short little wall. There is no need for a permit. There's no need for an inspection. Why are you wasting my time? And the contractor said, no, you don't understand. I was required to do this. So the inspector jumped on his phone and called some of the other inspectors around the area and said, is this right? Is there a change? Did any of you guys do this? They all agreed, we have never inspected a wall like this. We don't inspect a wall like this. There's no reason to do this. Nonetheless, he had to do it. The city required it. Ultimately, this inspector did call into the head office and they said, yeah, this is our new policy. We require this. So he ended up doing it. So here's kind of the two problems with that one. First of all, it cost him over $6,000 to pull this stuff up and throw it away and redo it so they could see the rebar go in before the cement went on top of it. And second of all, we adopt the building code by state law. It's the law that trumps any city ordinance. And it very clearly says any fence under 7 foot does not require a permit. Now, if they said, okay, well, we want to define this as a retaining wall, which they could do, it still says any retaining wall under 4 foot doesn't require a permit. This was under both. There was no reason to have it, but there was no way for this builder to do anything other than just comply, eat the $6,000 and redo the fence. Okay, one more real quick is we had a builder, and this is a bigger builder, and I don't know enough of the facts, so we're going to make some assumptions here, so work with me on it. But it's a big enough builder that there are multiple people involved in the process. So a foundation was getting ready to be poured. There was the superintendent or his assistant, somebody that was supposed to call for an inspection so that the inspector can come look at the foundation, and before it's poured, they want to be able to see all of the rebar, that it's wired together correctly, that we've met the standards necessary. So he made that call. And there was an assumption that that inspection would happen on a particular afternoon, and the foundation was scheduled to pour early the following morning. So there was no correction list. The contractor, the cement contractor that was scheduled to pour the foundation showed up as expected. There was nothing to tell him not to work. The cement trucks were on the way, so he poured the foundation. Now, there's some dispute. The city claims that there wasn't an inspection called. The builder insists there was, and the inspector just didn't show up. Regardless, there was no inspection. So the city has said to the builder, you will need to remove that foundation. Now, I don't know what the cost of that is, but it's going to be tens of thousands of dollars. It's a lot of cement, a lot of work, a lot of stuff to haul away. This particular builder has built a lot in this city. It's had a lot of foundation inspections. They have never once failed an inspection on the foundation. They've never even got a correction list. Their inspections are perfect every single time. It's a fairly easy process. Not a lot of things to go wrong. They've never had a problem. So the builder pointed that out. They also said, look, just to make sure so everybody has a record, it really was a mistake. We didn't mean to try and get past anything, and we understand the problem. So we will go hire a company with a big x-ray machine, and we'll come through and we'll look at every single wall, and we will find every single piece of rebar through the x-ray machine so we can see the grid, we can see what it is. It doesn't pick up overlaps. There are certain tiny details it doesn't get, but overall you have a pretty good idea what it does. The cities refused that offer and just said, no, you need to pull that foundation out. And so we end up with a problem that's really, really expensive. Now, for the homeowner on that house, it's not going to change the price. They're already committed to a price. But for future homes, that builder is going to have to figure out what that cost is and tack it on to all the homes they sell in the future in that area, well, anywhere for that matter, because they can't just eat that cost. The cost doesn't just evaporate. It's a huge amount of money that has to be factored into something somewhere. And it really doesn't gain us anything. It doesn't give us a better house. It doesn't give us anything other than we don't have the ability to challenge that and say, look, is there a more reasonable way to get at this? So this last year, there was a bill ran that the hope was to do that. And what the idea of the bill was to introduce the private sector to break up that monopoly and say, okay, a builder has the ability to reach out to a different inspector. If there is a problem with this particular city or this particular inspector, to break up that monopoly of the city and say, no, I'm going to bring someone else in. We're going to have free enterprise. We're going to have competition, and we're going to get the best, most effective and efficient inspections we possibly can. So initially, what the bill wanted to do is open it up to anybody who is licensed in the state of Utah to do these inspections. Now let's think about that for a minute. If you have any other license in the state of Utah, if you're a physician, if you're a funeral director, if you name it, there's a lot of licenses. Those licenses aren't limited to a city. They're limited to the state of Utah because there's a fairly rigorous process to get the license. Once you have it, you're qualified through a state of Utah license to do work within the state of Utah, except for building inspectors. So to become a licensed building inspector, you first have to pass a series of tests. And I say series because each type of inspection has a different test, has a different hoop you have to jump through to be able to be the inspector for that type of inspection. So there's commercial and there's residential. They have to go through all of those tests through ICC, which is the International Code Council. The tests are really difficult. They take a lot of study, and the books, the code books that they have to study are written at a level that is more advanced than most college texts. It really is advanced. It really is difficult. And it takes some work to get it. So there's some level of accomplishment there. Once you've got that certification, ICC also has a code of ethics. If you do something that is unethical, even though you've passed the test, they will pull back that certification. So once you've jumped through that hoop, then you have to go to the state. And the state looks at your criminal background. They do some research on an individual and say, okay, you got the certification. You seem to be a person in good standing in the community. We will give you a state license. The way it currently is, then with that state license, you go get a job with a city or a county, a municipality, and then you can do inspections. Now, we do have some private inspectors, but they still get hired through the city. But that's where it ends. That's how the control works, is you work for that city. What the idea was is that we would add a couple different layers of safety for the public, but open it up to the private market. So the different layers would be, you would still have to go through that process. You would still have to become state licensed. And if you wanted to be a private inspector, on top of that, you'd have to go get some sort of insurance, similar to what an engineer gets. So an engineer comes in and designs a structure and says, here's what it's going to take to carry the weight, withstand the wind, whatever it may be. And they have to have some sort of insurance should that fail. They also assumed the liability. So it would be the same for a building inspector, that they would have to assume the liability that says, look, I did the inspection. If there was ever a problem with the structure, and it turned out that problem was because the building inspector didn't do the inspection or did it poorly, they would have some liability on that. So it adds additional levels of security for the homeowner. It also adds a different level of efficiency, because now if you have a city that's way behind or a city that's just traditionally difficult to get your inspections passed through, you can bring in a private inspector that still meets all of those standards and still expected to do a good job, and they'll do the inspection. The League of Cities and Towns adamantly opposed this. Again, they went back to the theory we talked about before, where they believed that the only way to keep the public safe is you have to have that disinterested, centralized government control do those inspections. And they were able to prevail on this. So they changed the bill to where it now only applies if an inspection goes beyond 3 days. So there's a law in the books that says if you call for an inspection, that within 3 days, the inspectors need to come perform that inspection. So this says, well, within 3 days, if they don't, then the builder has the ability to call for an inspection. But it has to be an inspector that the city has already approved. So a lot of the cities are setting up interlocal agreements, which is awesome. It may give us the ability to move inspectors from city to city, so it still may have a good result, but it really doesn't get at the problem at hand, that the inspection process, because it is so held hostage by just the cities, has a lot of inefficiencies in it. And I guess one of the other things just to point out is if a city currently gets over the 3-day limit, they do hire third-party inspectors. We have a bunch of them in the state, and they will bring them in to help get them caught up and do their best to stay caught up. So the concept of a third-party inspector is already introduced. We have certain areas, certain counties in the state, because they're larger, they just tell the builder, hey, there's one county, they don't even have a building official. They just say, go hire a third-party inspector. As long as they're licensed, you bring the paperwork into the county, we'll accept it, we'll get you your certificate of occupancy, and you can go through it. So the concept isn't new. Even more importantly, one that we're all aware of, we may not think we're aware of, but we are, is any public buildings. Any buildings that are state-owned buildings, and that includes schools, they are never inspected by a city inspector. They're always inspected by whoever owns the building. So the school district does their own inspections. And I believe that we all believe schools are pretty safe. They do a really good job. So it's not a flawed theory, and we believe it would work and bring a whole bunch of efficiency to what we need in the state. So hopefully we will have a change that evolves over the next year, and we can get all the stakeholders to the table and say, hey, can we make this work and still have it be a really good, effective process? We believe everyone deserves a home. Let's remove the barriers.